The Pentagon thought it knew how this story would go, but Iran wasn't trying to win the way America expected. Dramatic pause. It was trying to make winning feel impossible. Tense music. In this video, we're breaking down the strategy that shocked military planners, rattled global shipping, and exposed a brutal truth about modern warfare. Sometimes the side with the smaller budget can still control the board. And trust me, the most chilling part isn't what Iran launched. It's what the Pentagon realized way too late. So let's start here. When most people imagine a showdown between the United States and Iran, they picture fighter jets, bunker-busting bombs, aircraft carriers, and some giant made-for-TV military clash. That's the image. That's the expectation. That's the movie version. But Iran has spent years building a strategy designed to avoid that exact fight. Why? Because fighting America head-on would be suicidal. Tehran knew that. Its commanders knew that. Its planners knew that. So instead of preparing for one massive knockout punch, Iran prepared for something slower, messier, and much harder to stop. It built a network. Not just missiles, not just drones, a network, allies, militias, supply lines, deniable attacks, political pressure, economic disruption, cyber operations, and cheap weapons that force richer enemies to burn through expensive defenses. And that's where things start to get dangerous, because the Pentagon is built to destroy armies, air forces, navies, command centers. But what happens when the real target isn't military defeat? What happens when the goal is to drain patience, money, attention, and political will? That's the game Iran learned to play. And once you see it, everything that happened afterward starts to make terrifying sense. First, Iran understood something that big powers often forget. You do not need to beat a superpower everywhere. You only need to create enough fires in enough places that the superpower is forced to chase all of them at once. That's why Tehran spent decades building relationships with armed groups across the region. Hezbollah in Lebanon, militias in Iraq and Syria, the Houthis in Yemen, Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad in the Palestinian territories. Different groups, different local agendas, but together they create what many analysts call Iran's axis of resistance. And this network gave Tehran something priceless: reach without full exposure. If one group attacks, Iran can deny direct responsibility. If tensions rise, it can calibrate. If pressure builds, it can shift the battlefield. It's like fighting a shadow with fingerprints but no fixed address. And that matters, because one of the biggest advantages of the proxy model is that it shields Iran from the full force of direct retaliation. America might strike a militia warehouse, a launch site, or a commander linked to a partner group. But that is not the same as launching total war on Iran itself. In other words, Tehran found a way to hurt its enemies while making escalation far more complicated. Sounds simple, right? It isn't. It's one of the most important strategic ideas in the whole story. Iran didn't need every proxy to be perfectly controlled. It just needed a regional web that could create constant pressure, constant uncertainty, and constant risk. And that pressure became impossible to ignore after the war in Gaza exploded and the region started heating up. Suddenly, attacks weren't just local anymore. The battlefield stretched from Israel's borders to US bases to shipping lanes thousands of miles away. And this is where the Pentagon's problem got bigger, because now the question was no longer, can we stop Iran? The question became, which threat do we stop first? But wait, it gets even crazier, because Iran's smartest move may not have been on land at all. It was at sea. Think about the Red Sea for a second. For most people, it's just a body of water on a map. But strategically, it's a pressure point for the global economy. A huge share of world shipping passes through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal route. Disrupt that lane, and you don't just create a military problem. You create an economic one. Suddenly, shipping companies reroute. Insurance premiums rise, delivery times stretch, factories wait for parts, prices creep upward, politicians start hearing from business leaders, voters feel the pain without ever seeing a missile launch. That is the genius and the cruelty of this kind of strategy. You don't need to sink every ship. You just need to make the route feel dangerous enough that the world reacts. And that is exactly why attacks by the Houthis hit so hard. These weren't just symbolic launches into the void. They shook trade patterns, alarmed governments, and forced companies to consider longer, more expensive routes around southern Africa. Some firms paused transit, war risk insurance climbed. Even private discussions among major financial players reflected fear that the crisis could add inflationary pressure and complicate already fragile economies. In Spain, Michelin factories planned output halts because delays in raw materials were already hitting supply chains. Read that again. A militia in Yemen, backed by Iran, helped trigger disruptions that could be felt in European industry. That's not a sideshow, that's strategic reach. And this is where a lot of people miss the point. They looked at the Houthis and saw a regional armed group. Iran looked at the Houthis and saw leverage over one of the world's most sensitive commercial arteries. That changes everything, because once global trade is in the crosshairs, the battlefield is no longer just military. It becomes political, financial, and psychological. Every missile now has an echo in fuel costs, shipping rates, stock markets, and diplomatic meetings. The Pentagon can launch strikes on missile sites, and it did. But every new launch from Yemen sent the same message. You can hit us, but can you stop the disruption? That question haunted the whole campaign. And if you think the answer was simple, think again. Because this is where the cost trap appears. And honestly, this may be the part that worried defense planners the most. Picture this. A one-way attack drone that costs somewhere around the price of a luxury car, maybe $20,000 to $50,000. Now picture the interceptor missile used to stop it. In some cases, that defense can cost millions. To kill something that costs a tiny fraction of that. One Reuters analysis cited estimates that the cost of a single Patriot interceptor, roughly $4 million, could equal the price of around 115 Shahed-style one-way drones. Let that sink in. One expensive defensive shot versus a swarm potential on the other side. That's not just a tactical problem, that's a math problem. And math, unlike political speeches, does not care who sounds stronger on television. Former Pentagon Weapons Chief Bill LaPlante openly warned lawmakers that if you are shooting down a roughly $50,000 one-way drone with a missile costing around $3 million, that's not a good cost equation. He wasn't being dramatic. He was describing a strategic imbalance in plain English. The economics of air defense were becoming ugly, fast, and that imbalance was already visible in the Red Sea, where U.S. officials and defense analysts said the U.S. Navy had spent around $1 billion or more in munitions defending ships from low-cost Houthi missiles and drones. Think about what that means. Iran and its allies didn't need perfect accuracy. They didn't need technological superiority in every category. They needed a system that forced a far richer opponent to spend heavily, deploy heavily, stay alert constantly, and remain stretched over time. This is where things take a dark turn, because once a war becomes a contest of attrition in money, attention, and industrial output, even the strongest military can feel trapped. The U.S. can absolutely destroy targets, no question, but can it destroy the cheap drone problem faster than the cheap drone problem can regenerate? That's the nightmare. Attack has become cheap. Defense is often still expensive, and when that gap opens wide enough, the weaker side suddenly gains a terrifying kind of power. Not because it can dominate the skies in a traditional sense, but because it can keep forcing the stronger side into bad exchanges, bad trades, bad equations, bad choices. And if you're sitting in the Pentagon, looking at maps and budgets and interceptor stockpiles, that's the kind of realization that keeps you awake at night. But the money wasn't the only thing Iran was targeting. It was targeting time. Time is the secret weapon nobody talks about enough. America often fights with the logic of campaigns. Identify the threat, degrade the threat, restore deterrence. That framework makes sense when the enemy is centralized and the objectives are clear. Iran's strategy was different. It was built on the idea that survival plus disruption can be a kind of victory by itself. Not a parade in the streets victory, not a clean battlefield victory, something colder than that. A strategic victory measured in endurance. If Tehran could stay in the game, keep the region tense, keep markets nervous, keep allies activated, and keep the United States tied down without triggering an all-out war it could not win, then parts of its strategy were working. And that's exactly why some analysts argue that Iran's approach was never about one decisive blow. It was about repeated timed disruption across multiple domains: missiles, drones, maritime attacks, public threats, cyber pressure, information pressure, pressure on infrastructure, pressure on shipping, pressure on policymakers. The target wasn't just a base or a ship. The target was flow, fuel, cargo, data, money, confidence. One CSIS analysis described this as a multi-domain punishment campaign, where the point is not necessarily military conquest, but political and economic coercion. In that model, you don't have to crush your enemy's army. You just have to raise the cost of continuing. That is such an important shift, and most people never hear it explained this way. Iran's strategy worked when it made each response harder, costlier, and more politically loaded than the last. Worked when it pushed adversaries into a cycle of defending everything, everywhere, all at once. Worked when it forced the conversation away from how do we win and toward how long can we sustain this. That is a completely different battlefield. And here's the twist. Even when Iran's partners took losses, even when US or allied forces intercepted attacks, even when launch sites got hit, the broader logic of the strategy could still hold. Because the question wasn't whether every missile landed. The question was whether the pressure continued. And too often, it did. You won't believe what happened next, because the next layer of the strategy may be the most misunderstood of all: deniability. In conventional war, responsibility is obvious. One army crosses a border. One air force bombs a target. Everyone knows who did what. Iran's model thrives in the gray zone. Through its regional network, Tehran can influence events, support attacks, transfer weapons, provide training, and still complicate the political decision to strike Iran directly. US officials have publicly accused Iran and the IRGC of helping the Houthis with the weaponry, intelligence, planning, execution, and authorization behind attacks in the Red Sea. Iran has denied direct involvement, and that gap between accusation and denial is where the strategy breathes. Because as long as there is room for ambiguity, room for debate, room for calibrated response, Iran gains space. Space to maneuver, space to avoid direct war, space to let others absorb the first wave of retaliation. It's not that Iran becomes untouchable, it's that hitting Iran directly becomes a much bigger, riskier political decision. And that matters, because escalation in the Middle East is never local for long. Strike too hard, and you risk dragging in more actors, more fronts, more consequences. Hold back, and the pressure continues. That is the trap. Iran built a structure where almost every option available to its enemies carries serious downside. And if you're wondering whether this was intentional, the answer seems pretty clear. Analysts at CFR note that acting through proxies lets Iran back actions it favors while trying to shield itself from direct retaliation, and that has been one of the biggest strategic advantages of the model. Suddenly, what looked chaotic starts to look methodical. The drone launches, the maritime harassment, the regional partners, the timing, the denials, the economic ripples. It all points to the same brutal insight. Iran was not trying to fight America's war. It was trying to force America into Iran's kind of war. Slower, murkier, more exhausting, more expensive, more politically corrosive. And once you understand that, another disturbing detail comes into focus. Iran may have correctly judged that democracies and global markets are more vulnerable to sustained pressure than authoritarian systems already hardened by sanctions, isolation, and instability. Think about that for a second. Tehran's leaders did not need their citizens to be comfortable. They did not need the global press to admire them. They did not need a perfect image. They needed to convince their enemies that the cost of containing this pressure would keep rising. Rising shipping costs, rising insurance rates, rising risks to bases and ships, rising demand for interceptors, rising fear of regional escalation, rising political fatigue. That is an ugly but powerful form of leverage. And no, it doesn't mean Iran was invincible. Far from it. Iran faced sanctions, isolation, military risks, and enormous internal weaknesses. Its network also carried dangers, loss of control, overreach, retaliation, backlash. Proxy strategy is not clean. It can spiral, it can misfire, it can drag a state into exactly the war it wanted to avoid. So let's be clear. Saying the strategy worked does not mean Iran won everything. It means that in critical moments, Tehran achieved enough of its core aims to expose a weakness in the way stronger militaries think about deterrence. That weakness is simple. Destroying launchers is not the same as breaking the logic behind the launches. Shooting down drones is not the same as winning the cost equation. Striking militias is not the same as neutralizing the network effect. Protecting a ship is not the same as restoring confidence in an entire sea lane. And that gap between tactical success and strategic success, that gap is where the Pentagon ran into trouble, because military superiority still matters. Of course it does. The US and its allies can intercept, strike, deploy, protect, and impose enormous damage. But the modern battlefield increasingly punishes anyone who assumes technology alone will solve a problem rooted in economics, geography, politics, and time. Iran leaned into that reality. Cheap drones, partner forces, choke points, ambiguity, repetition, psychological pressure. The formula wasn't elegant, it was relentless, and that's why this story matters far beyond Iran. Because what happened here is a warning about the future of conflict itself. The old model said the strongest side would dominate through precision, air power, and overwhelming firepower. The new model says a weaker side can still impose pain if it finds the right pressure points and is willing to fight dirty, fight patiently, and fight asymmetrically. That should scare everyone. Because if one relatively isolated power can force the world's most advanced military to burn through resources protecting trade routes from low-cost threats, what happens when more states and non-state actors copy the playbook? What happens when drone swarms get bigger, cheaper, smarter? What happens when cyber attacks are layered on top of maritime attacks, on top of proxy rocket fire, on top of political disinformation, on top of economic panic? You start to see the outline of a future where control doesn't belong automatically to the side with the fanciest weapons. It belongs to the side that can best manipulate the cost of response. And now we get to the most shocking part of all. Ready? Iran's most effective weapon may not have been a missile, a drone, or a militia. It may have been a question, a single question forced onto the Pentagon, onto US allies, onto shippers, insurers, investors, and governments. How much are you willing to spend, risk, and endure to keep this under control? That is the twist. Iran didn't need to conquer territory like a traditional empire. It didn't need to defeat the US military in a direct contest. It needed to prove that it could keep creating instability at a lower cost than its enemies could contain it. Once that became visible, the strategic shock was real. Because the Pentagon can prepare for a battle, it can prepare for a campaign, but preparing for an adversary whose main strength is turning every response into a more expensive problem. That's a different kind of war. A war of friction, a war of exhaustion, a war where the scoreboard is not just destroyed targets, but drained budgets, delayed cargo, rattled alliances, and fraying patience. And in that war, at least in some critical ways, Iran's strategy worked. Not perfectly, not permanently, not without blowback, but enough to expose the fault line, enough to prove the concept, enough to force the strongest players in the region to confront a reality they did not want to face. The age of cheap, deniable, Networked pressure is already here. Dramatic pause. So the next time you hear about a drone shot down, a ship rerouted, a militia strike intercepted, or a new emergency deployment to protect a maritime corridor, ask yourself this: was that a sign that deterrence succeeded, or was it proof that the trap is still working? Because sometimes the most dangerous strategy is not the one that wins in a single night. It's the one that survives long enough to rewrite the rules. If you want more deep breakdowns like this, hit subscribe, drop a comment with your take, and tell me which country's military strategy I should unpack next, because this story is far from over.